Hi, Rob.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I am very well. How are you?
I'm getting by. I should say for our podcast listeners that I'm Bob Wright and you're Rob Farley, and you are, I believe, in Israel. Apparently, the reports I'm getting from Israel are fragmentary, but according to what I've heard, you were abducted by a group of right-wing extremists who tried to brainwash you. Is that roughly? That's not true?
That's one way of interpreting it, I guess. I came over.
Subsidized?
Right.
No, sorry. You should put it in your own words. You're not responsible for anything I just said.
Right, indeed. I currently am in Israel. I've been here since June 9th, and I guess it's now June 29th. And I was brought over as part of 42 faculty members from various colleges around the country, various colleges and universities, as part of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's, Defense of Democracy project, like their campus project. The point being to bring American scholars, American academics over to Israel, show them what Israeli counterterrorism is like, and then, presumably have them return to the United States, spread the word, and so forth. And so I spent 11 days. Okay. The project actually ended on the 20th. I spent 11 days in depth in the Israeli security system.
Okay. I just went to Saudi Arabia and was accused of being brainwashed by the Saudi government, which paid for my trip.
Right.
The group that took you over does have a reputation for being. I guess they're commonly characterized as neoconservative.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Cliff May is the president, so that tells you one thing right there. Yeah. On the board of directors is Jack Kemp and Steve Forbes. And then distinguished advisors are Gingrich and Lieberman and a couple of other people. So, it's a reasonably conservative outfit. And it's affiliated, I don't know if it's directly affiliated, but the people who are in it are also affiliated with the new Middle East Studies Association. Not the Middle East Studies Association, but I guess it's the Association of Middle East Scholars or something. ASMIA is what it's called, which is also more of a right-leaning organization. So FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracy, is clearly within the sort of the right-wing system of think tanks.
And what kinds of things have they been trying to impress upon you in Israel?
Well, we got, as I said, a pretty in-depth examination of a ton of the different security institutions of Israel, from what the Navy does and around Gaza to the Border Patrol to what the Blue Force Police do. We got to talk to a Shin Bet interrogator. We got to spend some time in the West Bank. We got to spend some time at a settlement. So, really, they've been taking us around and doing a lot of things with us to talk about how difficult it is for Israel to deal with the problem of terrorism, and consequently how, and this was more implicit than really explicit and direct, but it was clear. Consequently, how much the United States should help out Israel and so forth.
It's funny. I was there in the late 1988, actually during the first Intifada. And and there was a kind of agenda. I was being ushered around mainly by government people, and there were things they were trying to impress on me. But what they were trying to impress on me was largely the threat from other nations. I remember how often they would say, right across there is Jordan. Do you realize how close, all these people are? And I may be, in retrospect, attributing more wisdom to myself than I actually possessed at the time, but it seems that I recall thinking, I don't think your problem is that Jordan's going to invade. I think your problem is that all these Palestinians in the West Bank hate you. And it's interesting that I'm wondering to what extent they are stressing to you threats from nation states as opposed to the terrorism threat. It sounds like it's mainly the latter now.
Right. Except for a little bit about Iran, there's almost nothing about threats from other nation states. We didn't take a trip to the Golan and see the Syrian positions. We didn't even take a trip north and watch where Hezbollah's launched rockets and so forth. It was very explicit, concentrated on the anti-terrorist institutions. And it surprised me. To the extent we even talked to people from the IDF. We talked to people whose job was, West Bank counterterrorism, not, fighting off the Egyptians or the Jordanians or whoever else. So it was squarely focused on the issue of terrorism and not the threat of nation states, with a little bit of Iran in there, but really not as much Iran as I had expected that there would be. So yeah, it's much more terrorism than nation state focused.
Of course, you're an actual national security expert, not just a foreign policy guy. So the actual nuts and bolts of defense and counterterrorism are what would be of interest to a group that you would be part of, right?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, not everybody there was, and who knows what an expert is. I guess I'm a scholar, and practitioners, I guess, would consider themselves experts. The group we were with, the 42 people, were actually quite diverse in terms of focus, because we had crim justice people, we had political scientists, from security-oriented political scientists to just general political scientists, and we even had some historians. So there was quite a diversity in terms of focus. Everybody was kind of focused either in the area or on the substantive questions of security and so forth. But not everybody was a specific national security scholar. So it was a very interesting group. It was actually, and I don't know if this came through in the applications, because everybody knows what the FDD is when they apply to this thing. So I don't know if it came through in the applications or it came through in the screening process. I mean, the group was definitely more conservative than a randomly picked selection of 40 faculty from these particular departments. I mean, that was pretty clear. Not necessarily more conservative, I would say, than the American public as a whole, but certainly more conservative than the American academic community as a whole. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Okay. And have you been surprised by anything? Is there anything that's made you? I mean, I don't actually know what your views were before in this realm, but is there anything you fundamentally rethought, or even kind of marginally rethought as a result of what you've seen?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, and it's interesting for a scholar of security, that I have tried for most of my academic career not to think very hard about the Israel-Palestine issue. Because it's one of those issues that if you think too hard about it, and especially if you talk about it, you always run into somebody who knows a lot more than you. And it's extremely emotional, and there are certain ways that it can threaten careers. So I have always sort of kept these issues at arm's length, despite the fact that, this is the center of my studying, the national security in general. In terms of, what they were trying to convince us in terms of having an agenda, they pushed pretty hard the idea that Islam in general and the Palestinians in particular are, I guess the term would be innately hostile, or they cannot be placated, they cannot be appeased.
They probably didn't say that about Islam per se, right?
Well, they did, actually.
The
very first lecture was about how Islam is inherently hostile to the West. And how
really did they quote from the Quran and stuff, or they're just talking about modern?
No, it was an hour and a half of quoting from the Quran about how Islam is inherently jihad, how Islam doesn't have the tool set that Christianity and Judaism have in terms of being able to develop a peaceful relationship with other religions. And thus that, there's no point in trying to appease Islam. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is exactly the same guy, after making this case for an hour and a half, then turned around and said, one of the ways to solve this is by trying to intimidate British clerics into issuing rulings favorable to the British state. As if that was going to change the entire nature of Islam. Muslim clerics, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean...
this was just an Israeli academic? He was not a government spokesman or anything? Not a government person?
It was an Israeli academic. A lot of academics have worked in the government before, so it wasn't a government spokesman. He doesn't work for the government now, as far as I can recall. But yeah, I mean, he was an Israeli academic.
Well, let me ask you this. Was the government the one ushering you from place to place? Had they set the agenda, or had the sponsors of the trip had probably set the agenda, right? So this is a reflection on the...
Right. The sponsors set the agenda. The sponsors certainly had access. I mean, we saw what was, for me, some really cool stuff. And some of the stuff I can't even talk about what we saw because it was off the record. But, you have to trust me, really cool Jack Bauer 24 stuff that we saw that was really awesome. And so they had.
We'll have to talk offline.
Right. I mean, we had sort of, I wouldn't call him our fixer, but he was sort of our Israeli guide. And he was really cool. And, I think he was like 5'2", and he's one of the scariest men I've ever met. Because, I looked at him, it's like, that guy could kill me 6 ways before I hit the ground. But he was really nice, and, it was just cool. I mean, there was a coolness factor to the whole trip, aside from the political element of it.
My memory of Israel is, this was one of 2 times in my life that I've locked myself out of my own car. One of them was in Israel. And what I discovered is that, so far as I can tell, every Israeli citizen is a trained commando.
Right.
I mean, it was like 5 people just to help, just descended on the car. I never could have gotten inside that car. And I don't know if that's relevant to your Shin Bet guy, but...
Well, I mean, one thing that's interesting for Americans who've never been to Israel is that it's sort of strange to see soldiers wandering around carrying their rifles, and you see them hitchhiking.
Well, we picked up a hitchhiker with a submachine gun,
right.
Which I would not do in America, needless to say. But this guy was wearing an Israeli uniform.
Right. No, we did the same thing, and not something you do in the United States, but something that's expected here.
Yeah. No, it's a security state.
Right.
Now, was there? So I was asking you, were your views changed in any way? I mean, I guess.
Right.
You mentioned that lecture. It sounds like that particular lecture did not persuade you of his view.
Right.
Maybe it persuaded you of something else, but.
Right. They made.
I assume your views were left of center going in.
Right.
Whatever that means. No kind of discernible impact?
Well, discernible impact. They made a very good case for the security fence. I had previously been somewhat agnostic on the security fence, given its impact on Palestinian society, its impact on the farmers along the border, and its sort of a unilateral change of the border. They made a very good statistical case for the security fence in terms of the security fence's ability to stop suicide bombings. Suicide bombings, of course, have dropped dramatically. And so they made a good case for it on straightforward counterterrorism, piling bombs onto their bodies, coming and blowing up nightclubs. Would I say that my views changed? I
certainly know more, and I'm certainly more receptive to the idea of the security fence now. I was not convinced about perhaps the least convincing element was the trip to the settlements, where we got a trip to a settlement, and we talked to a guy who had founded a settlement and who had been victim of a terrorist attack. And he spoke very movingly about being, his wife and son were killed in the terrorist attack while they were right next to him. And that was simultaneously moving and extremely manipulative. I felt very manipulated by being in that sort of conversation because, after all, we could have gone, the Foundation for Destruction of Democracies or whatever could have taken us to the West Bank, and we could have met with hundreds of Palestinians who have lost someone in the war. And those would have been equally moving and it's equally irrelevant to the political questions. So the settlements, I was utterly unconvinced. The security fence, there's a case to be made for it. So, to the extent...
I think there's little doubt that it has greatly reduced the incidence of suicide bombing. I don't think anybody disputes that, and then the question is whether it's worth the cost.
Right, exactly.
Now, a lot of stuff has been happening while you're over there.
Right.
There was the beginning of the ceasefire with Hamas or truce or whatever they're calling it, and then it was kind of immediately violated, not by Hamas, but I guess by Islamic Jihad, right? And I don't know, what is the status of it now? Is it more or less intact?
They have reopened the border crossings, and there was a lot of talk about it during the seminar. And the argument that was being made by some of our speakers was that Islamic Jihad can only do something in Gaza if Hamas lets them, which I found unconvincing. I think, I don't know whether the rest of the people found it convincing. But it seems like the Israeli government believes that Islamic Jihad can operate independent of Hamas, and thus that the rocket firing doesn't violate the ceasefire enough to completely abrogate it. That's one thing that's been going on here.
Well, and there's this problem built into the truce, I guess, which is that it only applies to Gaza. So what Islamic Jihad is claiming has happened, I think, is that Israel killed some of their guys in the West Bank,
right,
and the retaliation came from Gaza. But it does. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like an intrinsically complicating factor if the ceasefire only applies to Gaza.
Right, right, and one of the problems in any sort of discussion between the two entities here is that there are multiple entities on both sides, right? Even to the extent that there is an Israeli state, you have different people with different interests within that state, and of course you have all sorts of different entities in the Palestinian groups, and they don't control each other. So making an agreement with Gaza or with Hamas doesn't mean that you've made an agreement with all the other groups, and so you still have much mischief made.
Right, and that's a problem. Is that it seems that whenever we decide to do business with with a group that was previously too radical to do business with, by that time there's 2 or 3 smaller groups that are even more radical. But are people in general, are Israelis? I gather they're pretty pessimistic about the prospects for the truce, right?
The ones I have talked to, are, and this is separate from the people I've talked to, separate from the seminar, but not many of them seem very optimistic about the truce holding for very long. I mean, it's sort of interesting because we also have at the same time the prisoner exchange, which I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that's another thing that's really developing, and I guess it's really hitting right now.
I do have a long-standing question about Israeli prisoner exchanges in general, and I noticed this morning that Olmert, he got cabinet approval to release some, I guess, a deal with Hezbollah. There's 2 different deals going on. There's negotiating with Hamas over releasing a whole bunch of Palestinians for, I guess, that one Israeli soldier who presumably is living, right?
Right.
And then, but separate from that, I gather from the news account that the cabinet has approved this deal to turn over, 5, 10 living prisoners in exchange for what they think are going to only be the remains of 2 prisoners. In other words, they're giving up like 10 living people for 2 bodies, basically.
Right,
is that roughly?
Right. These are the.
And I.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, these are supposed to be the bodies of the 2 soldiers who were kidnapped in 2006, and this is the kidnapping that sparked the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. It's very curious. And what I have to say is that in my brief time in Israel, I have not been granted the ability to understand why. I mean, everybody here thinks that Olmert is doing this. Everybody here thinks that Olmert is doing this in terms of, or doing both the truce with Hamas and the peace negotiations with Syria and the prisoner trade-off with Hezbollah. Everyone thinks that he's doing this for just straightforward political advantage, right? That he's just trying to save his very weak position right now. What I don't understand is why trading a bunch of really bad guys, and there are some legitimately bad people, like Samir Kuntar, who's a really bad guy who was captured in 1979 and has been serving life prison for killing a 4-year-old, just beating her head in. And I don't understand why it is someone's political advantage to let someone like that go for the remains of 2 soldiers that they already think are dead. So, that's one where, I'm as clueless as you on why this seems to be a good idea.
Well, I've always been struck by, going way back, the kind of lopsided terms of exchange that Israel does on these things. I mean, it seems it's very often the case that they're releasing, like, tons of, say, Palestinians for a few Israelis, and it's always seemed to me that this was just an incentive for terrorists to abduct Israelis. And in fact, the Hamas deal, it's like Israel has offered to trade 450 or something Palestinian prisoners for 1 Israeli, and Hamas is holding out for 1,000. And I guess the reason they're holding out is because historically there are these lopsided terms of exchange. But it just seems especially hard to comprehend when all you're getting back is the remains of the soldiers, and it just seems like this so obviously is an incentive for terrorists to keep doing this. That I don't. I mean, presumably that's a big topic of conversation and debate in Israel, or
Right, it's been all over basically those conversations have been all over the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz and so forth. So, that's definitely. I mean, I guess one difference is that Israel just has so many more Palestinians and Hezbollah as prisoners than the other entities have of Israelis, right? So it is an asymmetric. It is an asymmetric thing in that the Israelis, when they want somebody, they go into the West Bank or they go into Gaza and they just take them, and so they have prisons full of Palestinian terrorists, Palestinian resistance fighters, whatever you want to call them, and the counter or the organizations on the other side don't have those kinds of hostages. So that's one part of it.
There's one other puzzle, and I should say, I mean, of course, I understand politicians are always under domestic political pressure when there is a living soldier in somebody else's hands to get them out. I understand that. But that's why just getting the remains of these two was especially puzzling, although there just may be something about Israeli culture I don't understand. I mean, I know some Israelis are extremely religious and some aren't, and I don't know how that all plays out as far as getting the remains back. But the other thing is apparently in this Hamas deal, Israel is continuing to refuse to include in the exchange Marwan Barghouti. And there are a lot of people who think that Israel, I mean, Barghouti is this guy who is in this interesting space on the Palestinian side, because on the one hand, he's done enough bad stuff to have street cred with fairly radical people. On the other hand, he's not like crazy radical, and in fact, he's thought to be someone you could do business with, right? And for years, there have been some people saying, look, Israel should think up some excuse to get this guy out of jail and re-inject him into the Palestinian political scene. And the only danger is that it would look like so orchestrated that people would start thinking he must be an Israeli pawn. Right. So I'm a little surprised. I mean, it seems like maybe Israel should take advantage of this opportunity to, in this deal they're doing with Hamas, to get rid of him. Are people talking about that?
Have I heard people talking about that? Not so much. I have in the past heard a lot of discussion about, of course, Israel's policy of target killings in the West Bank and Gaza. And the talk about that, sometimes some people make the argument that the people that Israel chooses to kill are not, in fact, all of the very worst people, right? That, in fact, sometimes the people that Israel chooses to kill are the people who could be, because they have a certain street cred, but they also have a certain level of moderation, these could be potential partners for peace, and that killing them as such is actually kind of counterproductive, because it prevents a voice from emerging on the other side, a voice that has both street cred and that has sort of a practical interest in coming to some kind of agreement with Israel. So I've heard that allegation in the past. Nobody's really talked about it on this particular visit this time, and I haven't heard much conversation about the guy whose name just suddenly slipped my mind.
Marwan Barghouti.
Exactly, Marwan Barghouti.
Okay. And so what is the overall? How strong is the sense of peril over there right now? I guess pretty reasonably grave. I mean, on the one hand, the suicide bombings have greatly subsided largely because of the terrorists. The fence. Or wall, or whatever you want to call it, right. And for the moment, there's a ceasefire that I guess is cut down on these incoming rockets pretty considerably, which of course never threatened the greater part of Israel. Right. But at the same time, I've got to think that since nobody thinks the ceasefire will hold, since Iran is what it is, and the demographic threat of growing Arab population is what it is, I would imagine there's not a tremendous sense of security over there.
No, there isn't. And this is sort of, and I hate to do you don't want to do the Tom Friedman thing where you talk about the cab driver that you spoke to and then use him as a proxy for the entire country. People always talk about politics here. From what I'm told, politics is more of a topic of conversation here than we would normally find in the United States, and so national security is always an issue too. What I've heard is people who, like you say, are a little bit, feel a little bit insecure for all of these reasons. Right. The rockets from Gaza, they've killed 15 people in 8 years. 15 people in 8 years is a tragedy. that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of statecraft, but it does create insecurity. The place where I'm staying right now, the proprietors told us last night about how the Hezbollah rockets landed on their property and killed a tree here or there. And so there is...
This was during the war,
This was during the war.
What, 2 summers ago now?
Yeah, 2 summers ago. We're pretty far north, so
Yeah.
the rockets could reach here.
Uh-huh.
So there is sort of that perpetual sense of insecurity. And I guess, if I were to delve a little bit deeper, I think part of the problem might be that Israelis feel that they've come so far in terms of making peace with Jordan, making peace with Egypt, having a strong relationship with the United States, Iraq, Saddam Hussein gone, all of these things, and yet they still feel insecure, right? And that's the real problem, right? That that there just is no light at the end of the tunnel, where we can think of Israel as being a secure, normal nation state, right? A nation state that just doesn't have to be afraid, even though it is the predominant military power in the region, right? That it still suffers insecurity, and that itself is extremely trying for the people here. Yeah, that's amateur psychologizing, I guess, but that's sort of the impression I get.
And what are you hearing about Iran specifically? It seems to me like over the last couple of months, you've heard more and more about the likelihood of an eventual Israeli strike. What's your sense there?
A couple of Israelis that I had a conversation with were sort of openly, they asked me about Barack Obama, they asked me about, we talked about when Israel, that if Israel was going to launch a strike, when Israel should launch a strike, and their attitude was, before Barack Obama becomes president, because they don't think that he'll go along with the strike. Whether that means that Israel is going to launch...
I wouldn't bet on that, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a big exercise, a big Air Force exercise in the Mediterranean just a few days ago, or I guess it was about a week ago now, and that got a lot of play and a lot of press, and that was understood as basically a dry run for attacking Iran. So yeah, there's a lot of concern about Iran, but it's competing with Hezbollah, which is part of the Iranian structure, and also Hamas.
And you said they mentioned Obama. Are you hearing a lot about the presidential race over there?
There's been a fair amount, both in the press and in just the common conversations, and there are, I've heard from several people who are pretty nervous about Obama. There seems to be a clear preference for McCain, but at the same time, I've seen a couple articles, and I've heard a couple people suggest that the press and the government are preparing the Israeli people for an Obama administration. Sort of looking at the writing on the wall now, which who knows what things will look like in November, but right now Barack Obama looks pretty good, and there's nothing that Israel really can do to stop Obama from becoming president, and so there may be a process now. Because I think I read an article in the Post, another one somewhere else that talked about, Obama is not going to be such a disaster for Israel, right? So, we'll learn to live with it.
What is it? Do you know specifically what it is that they are afraid would happen under an Obama administration?
It's pretty non-specific. I guess that, I live in Kentucky, and so strangely enough, a lot of the concern I hear about Obama here is similar to the concern I hear in Kentucky, right? He has Hussein as his middle name. He is perceived as someone who might be more receptive to the Islamic world than John McCain or George Bush or Bill Clinton, or of course Hillary Clinton. Those I think is the origin of the concern. And, whether that's reasonable or unreasonable, I'm not, it's hard to say at this point. Probably unreasonable. But.
So Obama's AIPAC speech did not persuade them?
Obama's AIPAC speech does not appear to have persuaded them that he is truly going to be a tremendous friend to Israel. Or, I guess has not persuaded them that he's going to be a greater friend to Israel than John McCain will be. But then, again, I read in the Post today an article that talked about the differences between Jewish perception of Obama in the United States and Jewish perceptions of Obama in Israel. And McCain cleanly wins, if Israel got a vote, McCain cleanly wins the state of Israel. But of course, Obama continues to dominate the Jewish vote in the United States, right? Maybe not by quite as much as Bill Clinton did, but still by a substantial margin. So, what Israeli preferences really mean is unclear.
Did he? Do you know? I mean, was there a lot of discussion of his AIPAC speech there? I was wondering if he lost points for the kind of walkback he had to do on using the phrase. What was it? Jerusalem must remain undivided, even after a two-state deal. Which I don't know if you were over there when that happened, because it got some real reaction from Palestinians over there, including Abbas and the chief Palestinian negotiator. Right? Did that?
Right. If I recall correctly, Hamas withdrew its endorsement of Obama because he said that.
Well, no, but not just Hamas. I mean, the Palestinian Authority. I mean, some people were saying that maybe getting Hamas to withdraw its endorsement, if that's actually what they did, was the whole point of the speech. But unfortunately for Obama, things that one phrase elicited a really strong counter reaction among moderate Palestinians, the ones who are our guys,
Right.
Did that not make much of a stir among Israelis there?
I wasn't here when the speech came down, so I missed that part. I can tell you that I haven't seen a lot of discussion of it since that time. Even in discussion of the American presidential race, they haven't really talked about his speech before AIPAC. You might be able to go back and do a search at the Jerusalem Post and find that they discussed it a lot, but I haven't seen it.
Okay. Have you managed to find any lefties over there among the Israelis?
Could you say that again?
Oh, have you managed to find any left of center people over there, Israelis? I thought you were going to talk to Gershom Gorenberg, right?
No, I talked to Gershom. That was a lot of fun. He was. I would say a powerful antidote to some of the speakers we'd had, which I knew it was going to be. I've read Gershom's stuff before, and he's always been really good.
Yeah.
Among the Israelis I've talked to, I've definitely met some left of center ones. I've met some. I met one and had a conversation the other day who's firmly in favor of a one-state solution, including.
That's pretty far left.
Right. A one-state solution that does not involve the expulsion of the Palestinians. I met. Well, and I should say, in FDD's defense, the guy they brought in specifically to talk about Palestinian terror made the argument that the settlements are the worst idea that Israel has ever had, that the settlements may well end up being the destruction of Israel. And he even went so far as to use the word apartheid regarding Israel's treatment of the West Bank. And so, in FDD's defense, they did bring someone in who, I don't know if I would in general classify him as a lefty, but he did make those kinds of arguments that are often made on the left with regard to Israeli treatment of the West Bank. So,
but do you get the impression that most Israelis still think that the settlements were not a mistake?
Were not a mistake. It's just really hard for me to say. I haven't talked to enough Israelis to get some good polling data on that, unfortunately. So yeah. Well, I guess this is another argument that they made in favor of the settlements, and this was part of the FDD thing, was that the argument was that once they pulled out of Gaza Strip, because they didn't have settlements, because they didn't have a presence, we no longer have any intelligence about what goes on in Gaza, so they can be doing anything they want to down there. In West Bank, of course, we have all these settlements, and we have this network of military control, and so we have tons of intel on where the terrorists are all the time, with the implication being that, even when you have a two-state solution, Israel would be more secure with the settlements. And I did hear one Israeli who was not part of FDD make that same argument. It's an argument that I find pretty uncompelling, and I don't know how widely it's held in the Israeli public at large, but it's an argument that was made.
Yeah. Okay. Because, you always hear, on the left in America, when the debate seems to be dominated by the right, or, kind of AIPAC level right, then the left in America says, well, you should see Israel. It's not all AIPAC over there. And I've always wondered, Well, whether that's true, I mean, whether how far, because I didn't get much of it. I was over there so long ago, I didn't get that clearer sense for where the center of gravity was on opinion there. But it sounds like you have not run into a lot of raving lefties over there by and large.
Not a ton, but I would still say that general impression is probably correct. That there is more vigorous debate back and forth on a lot of these questions than there would be in the United States. Again, the fact that they brought somebody in the FDD who used the word apartheid, right? I mean, Jimmy Carter used the word apartheid, and he's supposedly horrible now. And so, I mean, I think there is probably a greater range of opinion in Israel about the settlements, about some of these key questions, than there is in the mainstream political debate in the United States. So I'd say that's probably right from my own experience.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. How soon are you coming back to Kentucky?
We hope that we'll be coming back on Wednesday morning. Hope we'll be back in Kentucky on 10 o'clock Wednesday morning. That is what we're looking for. I love it. It's been a fine trip. Well, it's been a fine trip. I've been here too long. So.
Yeah. Well, you've been there how long?
It'll be
a couple weeks.
3 weeks now. 3 weeks, which is longer than we expected. Weeks. Yeah.
That's a long time on the road. Have you done any tourist? I mean, I remember when I was over there, I was for some reason shocked to see that there was a Benetton's in Nazareth when I was. I mean, I guess I imagine Nazareth having not changed since biblical times or anything. But have you done the big? The big tourist sites?
Yeah,
Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran Cave.
We walked the path of Christ twice. In fact, he fell down here several times or something like that. I read a book about the Crusaders before I came, so I've been really fascinated by some of the Crusader sites. We went up onto the Golan and we wandered through a Syrian bunker and through Castle Nimrod, which is this gigantic 13th century Arab castle that really puts all the other castles I've seen to shame. So yeah, we've done a lot of the touristy stuff since the end of the seminar.
Have you ventured into the West? Have you ventured into the West Bank at all?
Not on our own. That was just a little bit too adventurous for me. So we went there with the FDD, but not on our own.
Just to show you how much worse things have gotten since the first Intifada, when I was there. I was not even aware. I literally was not aware when I was going into the West Bank. I would just say to my wife, "Hey, let's go to Bethlehem." We would go and come back, and in retrospect, I remember that there had been these stop signs where these soldiers waved at it. We had to stop, and these soldiers would wave at us as we drove through. That was going into the West Bank, and nominally because of the Intifada, there was a strike of merchants in Bethlehem. But as soon as you got there, to the church on the spot where supposedly Jesus was born, these Arab merchants would wave you in, and they'd open their door and sell you stuff. I mean, there was just no sense of peril. I mean, things have gotten so much worse.
Right. You can no longer accidentally wander into the West Bank. That's for sure because of the fence. I should say that. I know that other people go to the West Bank, and I am just a wimp because we have not gone to the West Bank. So it probably has more to do with my sense of safety, my overdeveloped sense of safety, than with the actual threat there. I mean, I know there are places we really shouldn't go, but there are lots of other places where it's fine to go in the West Bank. But I just haven't gone. So.
Okay. Well, I think scholars will tell you that it's actually not entirely clear that Jesus was born in Bethlehem anyway, so in that case you probably weren't missing an actual deeply historical experience in the case of that. But
right.
And for that matter, one thing Americans don't realize, you can talk to a lot of Palestinian Arabs in Israel. I mean, we went to an Arab village that was a very interesting experience.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, Akko, we went to Akko today, and Akko is primarily Arab. And of course, Jerusalem, old city of Jerusalem, is if you wander through the markets there, you're primarily talking to Arabs. So,
sure.
One thing that was interesting is that our GPS, we bought a GPS device. It took us around, believe it or not, it would take us around Arab villages in Israel. So it was actually extremely inconvenient to try to find our way around places because the GPS kept telling us these odd ways to go that just avoided Arab villages.
So it was built into the GPS system that you would not find yourself traveling through an Arab village?
Right.
So this is like a private company in Israel that sells this type of GPS access or something, or?
Right. I mean, I don't know how it works, but I mean, we had heard about it before, and in fact, we were told, get one that keeps you away from the Arab villages, and we're like, well, I don't know. I think we can drive through them. But then we got one, and we actually had to plot our own way to places because it kept telling us to go around the Arab villages.
Wow, and that's supposed to be a safety device because you would supposedly be in danger?
I would presume so, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. Okay, well, thanks a lot for taking the time, Rob.
No problem.
And safe travels.
No, thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time on Blogging Heads.
All right, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right.